In this video, we examine why these Sherpas let this Karen die. From a Karen who took a map and used it to reach the one place she had been told not to go, to a Karen who sent away the only qualified person to recognize what was happening to her body, not knowing the most terrifying part had already been happening while she slept. It was August 19th, 2015. The sky above the canyon trailhead in Kane County, Utah, was completely clear, pale blue, no wind. 14 miles to the northeast, it had been raining since before dawn. Patrice Cannell was 46, worked part-time at a copy center in Denver, and lived alone in a rented apartment. The private canyon tour she had booked 6 months earlier, $650, paid in full, had been covered with money borrowed from her older brother under the understanding it was for transmission repairs. In the weeks before the trip, she had told co-workers she had invested heavily in a private excursion, emphasizing the private booking over the standard group rate. She arrived that morning with her gear already on, a printed itinerary in hand, one water bottle, and no communication device. Slot canyons in southern Utah are drainage corridors carved entirely by water, sitting below the surrounding terrain. Upstream basins can channel precipitation from miles away into a narrow corridor within an hour with no visible surface indication at the entry point. In closed sections, walls rise over 80 feet and passages narrow to 2 or 3 feet with no high ground, no exit, and no audible warning before a pulse arrives. Operators must suspend all tours under permit when upstream gauges cross defined thresholds. That morning, the threshold had been crossed by 7:45. The evening before, Patrice had called the tour office to confirm her departure. A staff member explained that tours could be suspended if overnight gauge readings reached threshold levels. Patrice told her to note in the booking that general weather advisories did not apply to private tours. The call was logged. Patrice arrived at the office at 8:40 a.m. The lead guide explained the cancellation and pulled up the upstream gauge reading on the monitoring system. He walked her through how a storm miles away produces a flood at the canyon floor with no surface indication at the entry point. She told him the sky was clear and that she did not find the explanation credible. She stated she had paid for a private booking and had waited 6 months. When he held the cancellation, she asked to speak with his supervisor. The owner reviewed the same gauge data and supported the guide without qualification. She turned back to the guide and told him he was the reason the industry was falling apart. He returned to his desk and wrote a formal incident report. The timestamp, 8:57 a.m. She was still in the building when he finished it. On her way out, she took the paper trail map from the display rack near the door. A hiker at the public trailhead parking area later reported seeing a woman, matching her description, enter the canyon mouth alone at approximately 9:20 a.m. At 9:51 a.m., a second surge was recorded at the upstream gauge station, and the flood pulse entered the drainage from the northeast. Based on her entry time and walking pace, Patrice had most likely reached a closed section of the corridor. Walls above 80 feet, passage narrowing to a few feet across, no accessible exits for nearly half a mile in either direction. The pulse moved through at an estimated 15 to 17 miles per hour. Her day pack was recovered the following day, wedged into a wall crack 14 feet above the canyon floor, carried there by the water, not placed. At approximately 9:55 a.m., the hiker at the parking area heard a sustained low rumble from inside the canyon, continuous and directional, unlike anything produced by weather. He moved to the trailhead and waited. She did not come back out. He called for help at 10:02 a.m. The cause of death was listed as drowning, consistent with flood inundation in an enclosed corridor. The coroner found no injuries predating the flood event. Her body was recovered 2.1 miles downstream the following morning, where the canyon opened into a broad wash. The tour operator submitted the guide's incident report alongside the gauge monitoring log, the prior evening's call log, and her original signed liability waiver. The operator was fully cleared. The case was closed. Patrice's brother was contacted as next of kin. When the circumstances were relayed to him, he told the officer he had not known she went to Utah. He said he had thought the money was for transmission repairs. It was February 14th, 2017. The temperature at the trailhead in the Bob Marshall Wilderness was 17 degrees Fahrenheit when the group assembled, and the wind out of the northwest was already pulling it lower. Delia Harmon was 52 and worked dispatch at a trucking company in Bozeman. She had signed up for the trip after her sister described the route as manageable, without mentioning she had gone in October. Delia came in February. She had not responded to either of the outfitters' pre-trip gear confirmation emails and arrived with ski resort snow pants, a fleece mid-layer, and a sleeping bag borrowed from a neighbor the night before. She said nothing about any of it. When the guide's assistant tried to follow up at check-in, she answered with a single word and turned away. The Bob Marshall Wilderness in mid-February is among the coldest interior corridors in the continental United States. Daytime temperatures at elevation average 15 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with overnight lows in exposed drainages dropping below -10 degrees Fahrenheit. The route crossed 2 frozen creek beds. The second had a compromised ice layer from a brief warming period 4 days prior, with water still actively moving beneath the surface. Cold water immersion at those temperatures saturates insulating layers immediately, and with continued wind exposure and physical exertion, the body loses core heat faster than it can produce it. Without a dry layer exchange, the window from immersion to dangerous core temperature loss runs between 45 and 90 minutes. At the trailhead, the lead guide opened the mandatory safety briefing and began a visual gear check. He noted Delia's layering system and snow pants, neither rated for backcountry winter conditions. But before he could address it directly, she stood, announced the group was wasting time, and started up the trail. 2 clients followed before he could finish. He completed the briefing for those who remained, which meant the crossing protocol for the second creek was never fully delivered to the group. At mile 3.1, he stopped everyone at the bank and began explaining the crossing procedure. Delia was already at the water's edge. On her third step, the ice fractured beneath her, and she went into mid-thigh on both legs before he pulled her to the far bank. He called for evacuation immediately and told her the wet clothing needed to come off for a dry layer swap. He had insulation in his pack. She refused. She demanded his certification number and said she would have him reported to the relevant licensing authority before the week was out. When 2 other clients moved to back the guide, she waved them off and walked ahead in soaked clothing. He logged the time at 1:47 p.m. and radioed base. Her pace dropped within minutes. By 700 feet from the crossing, her arms had stopped swinging and her steps had shortened to a shuffle. At 800 feet, she stopped moving and lowered herself into the snow. He reached her in under 2 minutes. She was conscious but not coherently responsive. She asked what time it was told, then asked again within 30 seconds. He set up a windbreak with 2 clients, removed her wet layers, replaced them with dry insulation from his pack, and activated heat packs against her torso and neck. Approximately 15 minutes after he reached her, the shivering stopped. A body stops shivering when it no longer has the capacity to generate the effort. A ground rescue team was dispatched, but terrain and distance put their arrival more than 4 hours out. Aerial extraction was not viable. Tree canopy across the route eliminated any landing or cable option. The team reached her position after dark. She had been unresponsive for more than 4 hours and remained so through the full transport to a medical facility. Delia Harmon was pronounced dead that evening. Core temperature at admission was 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Cause of death was listed as fatal hypothermia, with contributing factors including cold water immersion in sub-freezing conditions, refusal of immediate field clothing exchange, and sustained physical exertion in saturated layers following immersion. The guide's field log, radio records, and 4 client witness statements were submitted to the licensing review. He was cleared without conditions. Among his documented gear that day was an emergency insulation kit he had packed after noting her clothing at the trailhead. Extra weight he had carried for a client who never acknowledged the problem. It was the only reason there was anything to work with when she went down. It was July 22nd, 2017. The south rim of the Grand Canyon sits at nearly 7,000 feet, where late July mornings run mild and the sky opens wide above the canyon edge. 4,000 feet below, the inner gorge operates under an entirely different climate. Dark canyon walls absorbing and radiating heat through the afternoon with almost no airflow at depth. By midday, the canyon floor routinely reaches temperatures the rim never approaches. Marta Devon was 54 and had recently retired from a career in school library work in Columbus, Ohio. She was organized in the specific way that people who spend careers cataloging information tend to be. She arrived with a folder, printed resources, and cross-referenced notes. The problem was her sources. Her entire itinerary had been built from a travel blog written by someone who had completed the same trail in late September, a month when the inner canyon runs close to 30 degrees cooler than July. The departure time, the water recommendations, the expected conditions, all pulled from a post that had no bearing on what she was walking into. She carried 2 liters of water for a 9.5-mile one-way descent to the river. She had no desert hiking experience. The canyon's heat is not simply a function of air temperature. The walls, dense, dark, metamorphic rock, absorb solar radiation through the morning and release it at ground level through the afternoon, creating a radiant heat environment that persists regardless of cloud cover or time of day. Late July monitoring consistently records canyon floor temperatures between 110 and 118 degrees Fahrenheit between noon and 5 p.m. Without sufficient hydration, the body's sweating mechanism eventually shuts down entirely and core temperature climbs unchecked. The posted water minimum for a full river descent in July is 4 liters per person, with enforced rest at each rest house during peak heat hours. 3 heat advisory signs were posted at the trailhead that morning. A ranger was stationed there, specifically for heat intercepts, a standard summer assignment. He approached Marta at 11:42 a.m. and told her the canyon floor would reach between 110 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. He pointed out that her water supply was less than half the posted minimum for her stated destination. She produced the printed blog itinerary from her bag, held it flat between them, and pointed to the departure time on the page, indicating the source had a large readership and that his advisory contradicted published trail data. He told her the blog was not a safety source and did not step aside. She opened her small notebook, located his badge number on his uniform, and wrote it down in deliberate block letters without looking away from him. She told him she would be filing a formal complaint with his supervisor before she returned that evening. Then she walked around him and started down the trail. He completed his written incident log at 11:49 a.m., noting her name, destination, observed water supply, and the full exchange in sequence. Canyon floor temperature reached 112 degrees Fahrenheit by 2 p.m. Her personal GPS unit showed her last recorded movement at a point 0.3 miles below the 3-mile rest house at 2:17 p.m., with no movement after that timestamp. A group of 4 ascending hikers passed a woman resting against the canyon wall near that location at approximately 2:45 p.m. She did not respond when 2 of them acknowledged her as they passed. They assumed she was resting and kept moving. A second group of 2 hikers found her unresponsive on the trail at 3:30 p.m., roughly 80 feet from where the first group had seen her. Both water containers were empty. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, with no perspiration, consistent with heat stroke at the stage where the sweating mechanism has failed entirely. One hiker carried a satellite communicator and activated an emergency signal at 3:34 p.m. A rescue team was inserted to the nearest accessible point and reached her at approximately 4:15 p.m. Field assessment indicated core temperature above 106 degrees Fahrenheit. She was packaged, airlifted to the rim, and transferred by ground to a medical facility. She was pronounced dead that evening. Cause of death was listed as hyperthermia. Core temperature at admission was 107.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Contributing factors included midday descent and extreme ambient heat, critically insufficient water supply, and no rest or turnaround behavior recorded at any point along the route. The ranger's incident log, time-stamped 11:49 a.m., 2 hours and 28 minutes before her GPS stopped, was submitted alongside the GPS track data and witness statements from both hiker groups. He was fully cleared. Evidence returned to next of kin included the GPS unit, 2 empty water bottles, the printed blog itinerary, and a small notebook open to the first page, where his badge number was written in large, careful block letters. It was the last thing she had written. If you've made it this far, you already know how these go. 2 more stories after this one, and they get worse. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest when it drops. It was September 6th, 2016. Fremont Canyon is a narrow granite gorge in central Wyoming, carved into the high plains near Alcova Reservoir. Its walls drop sharply on both sides, threaded with crack routes and multi-pitch technical lines that draw experienced climbers from across the region. From the rim on a clear fall morning, it looks approachable. Bryn Halstead was 38 and worked as a physical therapist in Laramie. She climbed 3 to 4 times a week at an indoor gym and had been doing so for almost 2 years. Strong, coordinated, and genuinely capable on gym routes up to 5.10. She booked a guided technical ascent through a licensed outfitter in late August, rated herself as intermediate to advanced on the intake form, and selected a multi-pitch route that included a crack section rated 5.9. The gap she didn't know existed. Gym climbing does not involve crack technique. A hand jam, where the climber seats their hand inside a vertical rock fissure and applies outward pressure against both walls to generate a hold, has no equivalent in gym movement. She had never placed one. Fremont Canyon's routes shift in character as they gain elevation. The first 2 pitches on the route Bryn selected are face-dominant, positive holds, predictable movement, accessible to a competent gym climber. Pitch 3 opens into a sustained hand and finger crack rated 5.9. A grip on the exterior edge provides no load resistance on a vertical pitch, and fall geometry on this section is outward swinging. A climber whose weight sits outside the crack at failure generates a lateral pendulum arc of 8 to 12 feet, enough to contact the adjacent wall or the ledge system below. The day before the ascent, the licensed guide conducted a skills assessment at the canyon base. On a short crack section of the warm-up route, Bryn gripped the exterior edge with her thumb on top. Functional on a low-angle 5.6, useless on a vertical crack under load. He told her the scheduled route required demonstrated crack technique at a 5.8 level and offered 2 alternatives: a face route within her ability, or a rescheduled ascent after a crack clinic. She told him she had not driven 4 hours to climb a beginner route. At 7:44 p.m., he sent a formal written refusal to the outfitter and to her booking contact, stating plainly that her skill level was incompatible with the crack sequence on pitch 3. The next morning, she arrived at the storefront in person, told the front desk she was filing a formal complaint against the guide with the relevant certifying body, and left a signed written note on record. She then located a 26-year-old through a gear shop bulletin board who agreed to guide the same route for $120 Aiken cash. No formal certification, no state licensure. They began the ascent at 10:40 a.m. Pitches 1 and 2 went without incident. Both were face-dominant and the movement matched her gym experience closely enough to feel familiar. Pitch 3 changed at the 15-foot mark. The informal guide had already led and anchored above. Bryn followed on a top rope belay. At the crux, her right hand gripped the crack exterior rather than seating inside. Her left foot came off the face simultaneously. She came off the wall. The rope caught, but her body position produced a lateral swing of 8 to 10 feet. She contacted the wall, face first on her right side, then swung back across the pitch and struck a ledge outcropping on the left wall with her left hip and lower back. She was conscious after the fall and said she was fine. 20 seconds later, she asked what pitch they were on, the same question she had just answered. The informal guide began lowering her. Midway through the lower, she lost consciousness and did not respond to his voice. He called for help at 12:14 p.m. Signal dropped twice before her position was relayed clearly. Canyon wall clearance prevented aerial access. A rescue team rappelled from the rim and reached her at approximately 2:50 p.m. She was unresponsive throughout. She was pronounced dead at a medical facility at 5:22 p.m. Cause of death was listed as closed head injury and internal hemorrhage, consistent with high force lateral wall impact and secondary ledge strike. The coroner noted the absence of a helmet as a significant contributing factor. The lateral pendulum arc produced by her fall geometry meant her head contacted exposed granite at speed, with nothing between them. The licensing review centered on the informal guide. He was cited for operating without state licensure and required to cease all commercial guiding activity. No criminal charges were filed. He cooperated fully with investigators, and his account of the fall sequence matched the physical evidence recovered at the scene: rope position, anchor placement, and transfer markings on the wall at the point of impact. Without contradiction, the original guide was cleared before the review formally concluded. His written refusal had described the pitch 3 crack sequence. The specific technical deficiency he observed during the assessment and his reasoning for declining the route. Investigators noted that the fall occurred at the exact location and under the exact conditions he had outlined the evening before. There was nothing left for the review to determine about his conduct. The file was closed with no findings against him. It was May 3rd, 2016. Mera Peak stands at 21,247 feet in Nepal's Khumbu region, placing its upper slopes above most of the world's breathable atmosphere. High Camp sits at roughly 19,400 feet, where the air before dawn runs below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the summit is less than 2,000 vertical feet away. At that elevation, the body's margin for error is effectively gone. Renata Clifford was 44 and worked at a marketing firm in Portland, Oregon. She had taken up climbing in her late 30s. 5 years of Colorado 14ers, accumulated gear, and a habit of describing her experience in detail to anyone who asked. Mera Peak was the next logical step by her own accounting. She booked an 18-day guided expedition through a licensed outfitter in Kathmandu, arrived with a printed checklist pulled from a mountaineering forum, and had a return flight locked in for May 7th. She had communicated the departure date to the outfitter before leaving Portland and treated it on the mountain the same way she had communicated it, as a fixed condition, not a preference. At 21,247 feet, oxygen partial pressure is roughly 45% of what it is at sea level. Even well-acclimatized climbers at High Camp operate with blood oxygen saturation in the low to mid-80s. High-altitude pulmonary edema develops when the lungs respond to hypoxic conditions by allowing fluid to leak into the alveolar tissue. The lungs begin filling from within. First signs are breathlessness at rest and a wet, productive cough. Confusion follows, often with the person still insisting they are fine. The window between first clinical symptoms and incapacitation is 6 to 12 hours. Supplemental oxygen slows the progression. Only descent stops it. On day 9, during an acclimatization rotation, the lead Sherpa recorded Renata's resting blood oxygen saturation at 74%, low even by high-altitude standards, and recommended a rest day before any further ascent. She pulled out her printed expedition itinerary, pointed to the summit window, and told him the schedule had been confirmed with the outfitter before departure, and that a rest day was not part of what she had paid for. He noted the exchange and said nothing further. On day 12 at High Camp, his morning assessment found her reporting chest tightness she attributed to cold air. He asked her to take a full deep breath. She could not complete it without a wet, productive cough that stopped several other clients mid-preparation. Her SpO2 reading 68%. During the conversation that followed, she lost her train of thought twice within the same exchange. He told her plainly she needed to descend that morning. The summit attempt was finished. In front of 4 clients and the second Sherpa, Renata told him he was there to carry gear, not to make medical decisions. She dismissed him by name, instructed the second Sherpa to take her rope, and told the group to stop taking direction from him. He did not argue. He transferred his observation log, SpO2 readings, timestamps, written assessment, directly to the second Sherpa, radioed base camp, and began his descent per protocol. The second Sherpa, 23 years old and on only his second summit rotation, had no contractual authority to force a descent. He documented her condition in his own field notes and continued preparing the group. That evening, clients in adjacent tents reported a persistent wet cough from her side of camp from around 9 p.m. through midnight. After midnight, it stopped. At 5:20 a.m. on May 4th, the second Sherpa opened her tent for the summit departure call. She was on her back, unresponsive, lips faintly cyanotic, sleeping bag saturated with perspiration, despite overnight temperatures below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. He radioed base camp at 5:23 a.m. Helicopter response was denied. Aircraft could not safely operate above 18,000 feet, and the nearest viable landing zone was more than 3,000 vertical feet below. 2 clients began CPR under his direction and continued for 11 minutes. There was no response. She was pronounced dead at High Camp. Cause of death was high-altitude pulmonary edema. The coroner's report, processed at a medical facility in Kathmandu, listed the 68% SpO2 reading recorded that morning as clinically consistent with end-stage pulmonary fluid accumulation. The timeline in the lead Sherpa's field log matched the coroner's findings point for point. The morning assessment, the wet cough, the confusion. What he had written at high camp became the clinical record that explained everything found in her tent 14 hours later. Both Sherpas submitted their field notes to the outfitter's internal review and a separate report filed through the appropriate foreign affairs channels. The lead Sherpa was fully cleared. The review noted that his documentation before descending was the only reason the sequence of events could be reconstructed with the precision the report required. Body recovery from glaciated terrain required 3 additional days and coordination with 2 neighboring Sherpa teams. The outfitter revised their client agreement within 6 months. A mandatory descent clause, giving the lead Sherpa unilateral authority to initiate client descent without consent in cases of clinical altitude illness presentation. The clause did not exist the morning she handed over her rope. It existed because of it. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.